Malcolm X has been a mysterious figure to me for some time now. I had heard the name many times throughout my life, but knew extremely little about him. In school, most of our time spent on the civil rights movement was dedicated to Dr. King or Rosa Parks, and the other black leaders from this period were left out. Both of these figures are worthy of some serious study, but they do not tell the entire story of this era. I decided that it was finally time to rectify this gap in my knowledge, so I picked up a copy of the Autobiography of Malcolm X, and it quickly became my favorite read of a few years ago. Here's what I found out about him. Malcolm was born in Nebraska in 1925, but the family quickly moved to Lansing, Michigan. He had 6 brothers and sisters, and a loving mother and father. His father was a Baptist minister who helped organize for Marcus Garvey's UNIA, and he would sometimes take Malcolm to meetings. From the very beginning, Malcolm faced the consequences of white supremacy, as his family had to move several times to escape the Black Legion. At one point, they even had their home burned down. 4 of his father's 6 brothers were killed by violence, 3 by white men and 1 by lynching. Later, another brother was killed by police, and Malcolm's father soon met a violent demise as well. With all of this in mind, it is no wonder that Malcolm wrote, quote, "It has always been my belief that I too will die by violence," end quote. His father was supposedly killed by a tram, but rumors spread that the Black Legion was responsible. His mother had a premonition about this and told Malcolm's father to stay home that day, but he didn't listen. She spent the rest of the day crying until some police arrived and confirmed her vision. The father never came home. He lived for over 2 hours after being cut nearly in half. Upon his father's death, Malcolm's brother dropped out and got a job to help support the family. His mother took various cleaning jobs for white families who thought she was white because she was so light-skinned. Every time that these families found out that she was black, she would soon be fired. Despite a small welfare check and a widower's pension, the constant loss of jobs meant that she often had to buy on credit. When they were really broke, they would eat dandelion greens, oatmeal mush, and cornbread. His mother had a strong will about her, and he often saw her arguing with the welfare agents who sought to harass them about every possible thing. Eventually, she got a boyfriend for a brief period of time, but he realized that he couldn't support that large of a family, so he left. This was the last straw for the mother. Her mental health went downhill, which eventually landed her in a home. Malcolm was taken away to live with a wealthy white family, and as he was being taken away, Malcolm's mother yelled, "Don't feed him any pig!" This foreshadows his later conversion to Islam. Malcolm was put in an all-white school. His classmates and teachers openly used racial slurs without any care that he was sitting next to them. However, he did become popular because he was a novelty. Guys would even try to get girls to hook up with Malcolm, but eventually he realized that the white guys were just encouraging these girls because they knew if these girls did hook up with the black kid, then the white boys could blackmail that girl, and they could get her to do whatever they wanted. This time period also taught him that women believed that black men had an innate sexual superiority to white men. Malcolm was at the top of his class until a teacher told him that he couldn't be a lawyer because of his race. This destroyed all of his interest that he had in his education, so he dropped out of school and moved to Boston. This is where he met one of his future best friends, Sammy, who hooked him up with a gig shining shoes. Malcolm fell in love with the local party scene, and he began to dance as much as he could. Lindy hopping was the dance of the day, and Malcolm was damn good at it. He changed his style to fit his new life. He got a red conch hairstyle and a zoot suit. He also built up a side hustle of getting white men, black prostitutes at these parties. Whites loved to go to the black dances because these parties were much freer than the white counterparts. One day, he met a girl named Laura at the drugstore that he was working at. He soon discovered that she was the best dance partner that he was ever going to have. The two moved in perfect sync as if they were born to dance together. Sadly, he eventually ditched Laura for a white girl named Sophia because white women brought us black man status. Laura spent the rest of her life in and out of jail, something that Malcolm always blamed himself for. Malcolm then began dishwashing on a train, which takes him all over to the Northeast. On the first trip to Harlem, he fell in love with the city. There, he learned one of the most important lessons of his life during an argument with an army man who was drunk. He wrote, quote, "I never would forget that I couldn't have whipped the white man as badly with a club as I had with my mind," end quote. In Harlem, Malcolm began more debaucherous behavior as he began playing the numbers, selling weed, and carrying a gun. This caused him to spend a lot of time in the ghetto because, quote, "there were many more reefer smokers around there, but these were a cheaper type. This was the worst of the ghetto, the poorest people, the ones that in every ghetto keep themselves narcotized to keep from having to face their miserable existence," end quote. He soon realized that he could use his job as a dishwasher on a train to follow musicians around touring and sell them weed. He'd leave a cigarette pack full of blunts hidden in a random place, and once someone gave him money, he'd tell them where the pack was. He eventually left the railroad when someone snitched on him and he got spooked. When World War II broke out, he told the army that he wanted to steal guns and kill some white people. Needless to say, the army was hesitant to enlist him. Soon after this, the Harlem Riot of 1945 destroyed the local economy because whites no longer felt safe traveling there. To make money, Malcolm and Sammy began robbing wealthy homeowners. In one robbery, Sammy got grazed by a bullet, which led to an altercation where Malcolm hit Sammy's girlfriend and Sammy went for a gun to kill Malcolm. Malcolm also supplements his income during this time by working the numbers racket, bootlegging alcohol for a local club owner, and again helping to get black prostitutes for white men and women. The higher up in society that these people were, the kinkier their proclivities seemed to be. Sadomasochism and cuckolding were common desires among these people. Also, black men would dress as servicemen and go to fancy hotels after rich white women had ordered them, and nobody would question it because black men were always working for white women. Malcolm never saw a white prostitute touched by a white man. Malcolm spent most of his time on reefer, opium, or dope. It appeared that he was borderline suicidal at this point. He played Russian roulette to scare his friends, stole guns from local gang members, and got in an altercation with one of the higher-ups in the numbers racket. One day, Malcolm saw Sophia at a joint with a white man, who turned out to be the best friend of Sophia's husband. This man had wanted to come to the ghetto, but Sophia had argued against it because she was worried that someone would recognize her. Turns out that Malcolm went up to the table and said hello to her, before realizing who the man was. This man told Sophia's husband that Malcolm and her obviously had some history together, so the husband came to kill Malcolm. Thankfully, he had been arrested earlier that day after bringing a stolen pocket watch into a shop for repairs. This is how Malcolm landed himself in prison. Malcolm ended up serving 7 years for his burglaries. He wrote, quote, "I am not saying that there shouldn't be prisons, but there shouldn't be bars. Behind bars a man never reforms. He will never forget. He never will completely get over the bars." This is when his fascination with Islam first took root. Early on in his prison career, he was known as Satan because he was so irreligious. But that all changed when his brother and sister converted him to what they called the, quote, natural religion of the black man, end quote. This sect of Islam centered around a man named Elijah Muhammad and was called the Nation of Islam. This section of the book presents a departure in tone from the rest of the book, where the early sections feel somewhat lighthearted and sentimental, even in the darkest moments, but now changes to more of a lecture on his beliefs about Islam and the state of black man in America. The timeline gets a little confusing because he intersperses stories of his past with his current ideology. His interest in Islam paralleled a new fascination with learning. His correspondence with Elijah Muhammad encouraged him to expand his vocabulary and increase his skills at reading and writing. He found himself spending every day at the library, going through the dictionary and checking out more books than most inmates were allowed. He pored over these books through the night by a small stream of light coming from a corridor. He learned that, quote, "the black man, the original man, built great empires and civilizations and cultures while the white man was still living on all fours in caves. The devil white man down through history, out of his devilish nature, had pillaged, murdered, raped, and exploited every race of man, not white." End quote. Both Elijah and the books that Malcolm read encouraged radical transformation in his mind. Malcolm soon found himself involved in the prison debate circuit. The best debaters were the superstars of the prison, so he was rewarded for his time spent studying. Malcolm realized that the black man had been written out of history, and he used his debates to spread his knowledge of black history to other inmates. This stood against many historians' views at the time, who said that Africa had no history. He read Toynbee, John Brown, Gandhi, Harriet Beecher Stowe, W.E.B. Du Bois, classics like Paradise Lost, Oriental philosophy, and Western philosophy. He expressed his love of learning when he said, quote, "If I weren't out here every day battling the white man, I could spend the rest of my life reading, just satisfying my curiosity." And to Malcolm's surprise, his brother Reginald ended up falling out with Elijah and began to lose his mind. Malcolm originally thought that his deteriorating mental state was due to his rejection of the teachings, but later he realized that Reginald's mental downfall happened because his family rejected him after his break with Elijah. Soon after Malcolm's release from prison, Elijah asked him to stand up in front of the congregation. He wasn't just physically free from the prison cell, he was mentally free from the chains of white supremacy. Malcolm's last name was replaced by X to represent the name taken from his family when they were forced into slavery. It wasn't long before Elijah was so impressed with Malcolm that he was made the minister of New York City for the Nation of Islam. Malcolm and his fellow Muslims went on to great lengths to improve communities around them. They encouraged the consumption of healthy foods, shopped at black-owned businesses, and helped with the various tasks that locals couldn't manage on their own. Each member made a concerted effort to cleanse their body, mind, and soul. They also helped the drug addicts kick the addiction by feeding them and giving them a place to stay during their recovery. Each member kept a monk-like life, where they didn't sleep more than necessary for health, didn't take long vacations from work, did nothing injurious to the body, did not attend dances, didn't gamble, didn't have casual sexual encounters, and they were incredibly punctual. Malcolm himself said, quote, "I drive by my watch, not my speedometer. Time is more important to me than distance." End quote. Unfortunately, he was also developed a very sexist view of women. He wrote, quote, "Every month when I went to Chicago, I'd find that some sister had written complaining to Mr. Muhammad that I talked so hard against women when I taught our special classes about the different natures of the two sexes. Now, Islam has very strict laws and teachings about women, the core of them being that the true nature of man is to be strong and women's true nature is to be weak. And while a man must at all times respect a woman, at the same time he needs to understand that he must control her if he expects to be respected." Malcolm proposed to his wife Betty X in exactly as unromantic a way as you would expect from a man who said, quote, "I don't know how many marriage breakups are caused by these movies and television addicted women expecting some bouquet and kissing and hugging and being swept out like Cinderella for dinner and dancing, then getting mad when a poor scraggly husband comes in tired and sweaty from working like a dog, looking for some food." End quote. He simply had a few conversations with her and decided one day to call her and ask her to marry him. Once she agreed, he told her quickly to catch a flight to him, and that was that. For much of his marriage, he wasn't even around, sometimes leaving for 5 months at a time. The Nation of Islam started to show its collective power when a member was beaten up by police. Malcolm and the other members stood outside the precinct and demanded to see the man. He had a large wound on his head, and Malcolm made them call an ambulance. They no longer were going to put up with the police brutality. It wasn't long before Malcolm found himself the target of many, quote, Uncle Toms and angry intellectuals. He was constantly interrogated for his beliefs and the beliefs of Elijah Muhammad. He was often questioned about why he hated the white man, and he would respond with, quote, "For the white man to ask the black man if he hates him is like the rapist asking the raped, or the wolf asking the sheep, 'Do you hate me?' The white man is in no moral position to accuse anyone else of hate." End quote. He found his words constantly twisted and distorted by media outlets, which quickly left him disenchanted with the whole business. Every action done by a black man was seen as dangerous, even if a white man did the same things. He was interrogated as to why the Muslims were practicing judo and karate or purchasing guns, to which Malcolm always pointed out that these things were done by white men all over the country, and no one batted an eye. In fact, Malcolm argued that black people were some of the most peaceful on earth since they hadn't risen up and slaughtered their oppressors. Malcolm shunned the peaceful coexistence talk by Martin Luther King and instead wanted blacks to separate themselves from whites so they could reform themselves and reach a moral standard that would be approved by Allah on Judgment Day. Quote, "Segregation is where your life and liberty are controlled and regulated by someone else. Separation is that which is done voluntarily by two equals for the good of both." End quote. After all this change in his life, his belief seemed unshakable, or so he thought. He finally had an awakening to the lies of Elijah Muhammad when it came out that Elijah had been having affairs and conceived children with 2 different women. At first Malcolm didn't believe it, but eventually the evidence became too great. Malcolm became so concerned about Elijah's deception that he contacted a few excommunicated Muslims that used to work for Elijah. Malcolm discovered that Elijah had been talking behind his back as well. This shattered him. His final straw came when he was asked about the Kennedy's death, and he called it, quote, "chickens coming home to roost," end quote, which led Elijah to give him 9 days of isolation so that, quote, "the Muslims everywhere can be disassociated from the blunder," end quote. His break from Elijah hit him like a beautiful marriage ending in divorce, and he, quote, "felt as though something in his nature had failed, like the sun or the stars," end quote. In his sorrow, he found solace in his wife and the few friends that he had left. One of the friends that he turned to was Cassius Clay, who was beginning to become a big name in boxing. Malcolm even attended some of Cassius's fights. Still up to this point, Malcolm didn't quite realize the severity of his break from the Nation of Islam, until a member came to him to say that he had been tasked with killing Malcolm. He was supposed to plant a bomb in Malcolm's car, but thankfully he cared for Malcolm too much, so he warned him. Malcolm then realized that he needed to escape for a while, clear his head, and get to safety. He discovered the perfect solution to his problem when his sister offered to pay for him to fly to Mecca on a holy pilgrimage. Once he got approval for the pilgrimage, Malcolm began the most transformative journey of his entire life. Even the early stages of his travels changed his perspective. He saw white people treating him just as their fellow Muslim, not as lesser than them. He wrote, quote, "That morning was when I first began to reappraise the white man," In America, white man meant specific attitudes and actions towards the black man and toward all other non-white men. But in the Muslim world, I had seen that men with white complexions were more genuinely brotherly than anyone else had ever been. End quote. In Mecca, he saw, quote, the colorblindness of the Muslim world's religious society and the colorblindness of the Muslim world's human society, end quote, and said that, quote, these two influences had each day been making a greater impact and an increasing persuasion against my previous way of thinking, end quote. He also wrote, quote, never have I witnessed such sincere hospitality and the overwhelming spirit of true brotherhood as is practiced by people of all colors and races here in this ancient holy land, end quote. The main focus of the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca is to see the Kaaba. Malcolm went there 4 times and also spent time on Mount Arafat. He even gave one of the prayers on the mountain. He concluded his journey with a tour of the state of Arabia as a guest of Prince Faisal. His journeys made him almost forget his troubles back home, but he faced a rude awakening once he was stateside. The Nation of Islam had a lawsuit to force Malcolm and his family to vacate the house that they lived in. He tried to distance himself from the group and promote Sunni Islam. He began to teach Pan-Africanism and traveled to Ghana, Monrovia, Senegal, and Morocco. He was a new man by 1965 when 3 gunmen cut him down in the Audubon ballroom. At the end of his life, he wrote, quote, every morning when I wake up now, I regard it as having another borrowed day. In any city, wherever I go, making speeches, holding meetings of my organization, or attending to other business, black men are watching every move I make, awaiting their chance to kill me. Anyway, now, each day, if I live as if I'm already dead, and I tell you what I would like for you to do, when I am dead, I say it that way because from the things I know, I do not expect to live long enough to read this book in its finished form. I want you just to watch and see if I'm not right. What I have to say that the white man in his press is going to identify me with hate. End quote. One has to feel sorry that we only got a taste of peak Malcolm X. Most of his time spent in the public eye, he was under the spell of Elijah Muhammad. It was only after his pilgrimage to Mecca that we got to see Malcolm begin to function at his highest capacity. It makes you wonder what it could have been had Malcolm been allowed to live his life to its natural end. His daughter, who was 6 years old at the time, wrote, quote, Dear Daddy, I love you so. Oh dear, I wish you wasn't dead. End quote.